The gunshot echoed through the mountains, sending a flock of startled birds into the evening sky as Nora Fletcher urged her exhausted horse forward, the wind whipping tears from her eyes while the distant shouts of her pursuers grew fainter behind her. The year was 1879, and she'd been running for 3 days straight, her supplies dwindling, her hope fading with each passing mile through the rugged terrain of the Montana Territory. What had started in St. Louis as a desperate escape now seemed like a fool's errand as the setting sun cast long shadows across the unfamiliar landscape, painting the world in hues of orange and red that reminded her of the fire that had consumed her old life. Nora's mare stumbled on the uneven ground, nearly sending her flying. She patted the animal's neck, feeling the sweat-soaked coat beneath her palm. "Just a little farther, girl," she murmured, though she had no idea where they were heading. The saddlebags contained barely enough food for another day, and the water in her canteen sloshed with a disheartening lightness. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. Nora shivered in her thin dress, cursing herself for not having time to pack proper traveling clothes. The threadbare shawl around her shoulders did little to ward off the chill of the mountain air. Her only other possessions were the clothes on her back, a small pouch of coins sewn into her petticoat, and the damning letters hidden in the lining of her corset, evidence that could hang a man, and now might very well hang her too. In the distance, a faint glow flickered through the trees. Nora reined in her horse, wary but desperate. It could be a homestead or a small town, or it could be the men hunting her, setting up camp for the night. She had little choice. If she didn't find shelter and supplies soon, the wilderness would claim her before her pursuers ever could. She guided her mount toward the light, moving slowly to avoid making noise. As she approached, the trees thinned, revealing a small valley nestled between mountain slopes. Below her lay a scattering of buildings, a mining town from the look of it, with a main street bordered by wooden structures, some with lights spilling from their windows despite the late hour. A weathered sign came into view. "Welcome to Mineral Point, Montana Territory." Nora released a shaky breath. Civilization meant danger, but it also meant food, shelter, and perhaps a chance to lose herself among strangers. She nudged her horse forward, descending into the valley with caution, staying to the shadows where she could. The main street was quiet but not deserted. A saloon at the far end emanated piano music and raucous laughter, while a few people still moved along the boardwalks despite the late hour. She dismounted at the edge of town, leading her exhausted horse toward what appeared to be a livery stable. Her legs nearly gave way beneath her, stiff from days in the saddle. The stable door stood partially open, a lantern burning inside casting long shadows across the yard. "Hello," she called softly, hesitant to enter, uninvited but desperate for help. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, and Nora instinctively stepped back, her hand going to the small knife concealed in her boot, her only protection. "Whoa there," a deep voice said. "No need for alarm, madam." The stable lantern illuminated a man in his early 30s, with broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. His eyes, a startling blue even in the dim light, assessed her with concern rather than threat. He wore a cowboy hat pushed back on his head, revealing light brown hair that curled slightly at his temples. "My horse," Nora said, finding her voice. "She needs care. I've ridden her hard the past few days." The man stepped forward, taking the reins from Nora's trembling hands. His gaze swept over her disheveled appearance, taking in the torn hem of her dress and the dirt smudged across her face. "You look like you could use some care yourself, madam," he said, his tone gentle. "I'm Owen Vaughn. This is my stable." "I can pay," she said quickly, avoiding his implied question about her condition. "For the horses board and feed." Owen nodded slowly, seeming to understand her need for discretion. "Let me get your mount settled first. She's a fine animal, but you're right, she needs rest and water." He led the mare into the stable, and Nora followed, her legs unsteady. The warmth inside was welcome after the chill night air. Several horses occupied the stalls, most sleeping or munching contentedly on hay. Owen efficiently removed her saddle and began rubbing the mare down with a cloth. "You got a name?" he asked, not looking at her as his hands moved expertly over the horse. Nora hesitated. "Nora," she finally said, deciding honesty in small doses might serve her better than a web of lies she couldn't maintain. "Nora Fletcher." "Well, Miss Fletcher, there's a hotel down the street, the Silver Strike. Nothing fancy, but the beds are clean and the owner, Mrs. Peterson, doesn't ask too many questions." "Thank you," Nora said, leaning against a post for support as exhaustion threatened to overtake her. "And my saddlebags?" "I'll bring them along. You don't look in any condition to be carrying anything," Owen said, finishing with the horse and turning to face her. In the better light inside the stable, his expression grew more concerned. "When's the last time you ate something?" As if in response, Nora's stomach growled audibly. She flushed with embarrassment. "Yesterday morning. I've been in a hurry." Owen nodded again, not pressing for details. "The hotel serves meals, but the kitchen's closed for the night. I've got some bread and cheese at my place behind the stable." "Not much, but it'll tide you over until morning." Nora weighed her options quickly. This man seemed trustworthy and she was nearly dead on her feet. If he'd wanted to harm her, he could have done so already. "That's very kind," she said. "I'd be grateful." Owen grabbed her saddlebags and led her through the back of the stable to a small cabin. It was simple but tidy, with a table and chairs, a cook stove, and a narrow bed in one corner. He lit a lamp and gestured for her to sit at the table while he placed a loaf of bread, some cheese, and dried beef before her. "It's not much," he apologized. "It's perfect," Nora said, trying to restrain herself from devouring the food like a starving animal. She tore off a piece of bread, savoring the simple sustenance. Owen poured her a cup of water from a pitcher and sat across from her. His presence was solid, reassuring rather than threatening, though she remained on guard. "So," he said after she'd eaten for a few minutes in silence, "you're running from something." It wasn't a question. Nora's hand froze halfway to her mouth. "What makes you say that?" Owen's lips curved in a slight smile. 10 years in this territory teaches you to read people. No woman rides into Mineral Point alone at night, half-starved and looking over her shoulder unless trouble's on her tail. Nora set down the bread, appetite suddenly diminished. "I should go." "No need," Owen said quickly. "Your business is your own. But if you're in danger, it might help to know what I'm looking out for." "You'd help a stranger, without knowing what I've done?" Nora asked skeptically. Owen's eyes held her steadily. "I tend to judge folks by what's in front of me, not by rumors or accusations. And what I see is a woman who needs help, not judgment." Something in his straightforward manner broke through Nora's defenses. She hadn't slept properly in days, was physically and emotionally exhausted, and desperately needed an ally. "There are men following me," she admitted. 3, maybe 4. They'll be asking questions, showing my photograph. They're dangerous men who work for someone even more dangerous." Owen nodded, not seeming surprised. "These men, they wearing badges?" "No," Nora said firmly. "They're not lawmen, though they might pretend to be." "That simplifies things," Owen said. "Finish your food. I'll walk you to the hotel after. Mrs. Peterson's husband was a friend of mine before the consumption took him. She'll give you a room at the back with no questions asked." True to his word, Owen escorted her to the Silver Strike Hotel once she'd eaten. The night air had grown colder, and he'd insisted she take his coat, draping the heavy garment around her shoulders. The main street was quiet now, most of the buildings dark except for the saloon, which still hummed with activity. The hotel was a two-story wooden structure with a small lobby illuminated by a single lamp. Mrs. Peterson, a stout woman with iron-gray hair pinned severely atop her head, emerged from a back room at the sound of the bell over the door. "Owen Vaughn," she said, her stern expression softening slightly. "What brings you here at this hour?" "Evening, Martha," Owen said, removing his hat. "This is Miss Fletcher. She needs a room, preferably one at the back of the house." Mrs. Peterson's sharp eyes took in Nora's disheveled appearance, but, true to Owen's word, she asked no questions. "Room 6 is available. $2 for the night, breakfast included." Nora reached for the hidden pocket in her petticoat, but Owen stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Put it on my account, Martha," he said. "I'll settle up end of the month as usual." Before Nora could protest, Mrs. Peterson nodded and retrieved a key from the rack behind her. "This way, Miss Fletcher," Nora turned to Owen. "I can't let you can repay me tomorrow," he said quietly. "Get some rest. I'll check on your horse in the morning." "Thank you," Nora said, meaning it more deeply than she could express. "For everything." Owen nodded, placing his hat back on his head. "Lock your door and get some sleep. Things often look clearer in the light of day." Mrs. Peterson led Nora up a narrow staircase to a small but clean room with a bed, washstand, and chair. The window overlooked an alley rather than the main street, exactly what Nora needed. "Breakfast is served from 6 to 8, the older woman said, handing over the key. "Pump for washing up is in the yard out back." "Thank you," Nora said, suddenly swaying on her feet as the last of her energy drained away. Mrs. Peterson's expression softened marginally. "Owen's a good man. If he's looking out for you, you could do worse." With that cryptic comment, she left, closing the door behind her. Alone at last, Nora turned the key in the lock and leaned against the door, exhaling deeply. She removed Owen's coat, hanging it carefully on a hook, and then stripped off her filthy dress. Using water from the pitcher on the washstand, she cleaned herself as best she could, washing away days of dirt and fear. The bed, though narrow, felt like heaven after nights spent sleeping in fits and starts on the hard ground. Nora tucked the letters from her corset under the pillow, keeping her knife within reach, and fell into the deep sleep of the truly exhausted. Morning came with bright sunlight streaming through the thin curtains and the distant sounds of a town coming to life. For a moment, Nora didn't remember where she was, panic surging through her until the events of the previous night came flooding back. She sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles from days in the saddle. Her dress, now dried from her hasty washing the night before, was presentable enough, though the torn hem would draw attention. She dressed quickly, securing the letters back in her corset and her knife in her boot. After splashing water on her face and attempting to tame her tangled hair, she felt somewhat human again. Downstairs, the small dining room contained a few early risers, a pair of miners drinking coffee at one table, and an older gentleman reading a newspaper at another. Mrs. Peterson emerged from the kitchen carrying a plate of eggs and bacon. "Sit anywhere," she told Nora, setting the food before one of the miners. "Coffee's hot." Nora chose a table in the corner with a view of both the door and the window facing the street. She was halfway through a surprisingly good breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits when the bell over the hotel door jingled. Owen Vaughn entered, hat in hand, his gaze finding her immediately. Something in his expression made her tense a wariness that hadn't been there the night before. "Morning, Miss Fletcher," he said, crossing to her table. "May I join you?" Nora nodded, studying his face as he sat across from her. "Is something wrong?" "My horse. Your mare is fine. Resting comfortably," he said, his voice low enough that the other diners couldn't overhear. "But there are 3 men at the saloon asking after a woman matching your description. They arrived before dawn." Nora's appetite vanished. Her hand tightened around her fork, knuckles white. "What did they say?" "That you're a thief who stole valuable property from their employer in St. Louis. That you're dangerous and not to be trusted." Owen's blue eyes held her steadily. "They're offering $50 for information leading to your capture." "And what did you tell them?" Nora asked, hardly daring to breathe. "Nothing yet," Owen replied. "Thought I should hear your side of the story first." Nora glanced around the room, acutely aware of how exposed they were. "Not here." Owen nodded his understanding. "Finish your breakfast. Meet me at the stable in 10 minutes. Bring your things we might need to move quickly." After he left, Nora forced herself to eat a few more bites, knowing she needed the strength. She paid Mrs. Peterson with coins from her hidden supply, retrieved her few belongings, and slipped out the back door of the hotel. The morning air was crisp, the sky a clear blue that seemed to mock her dire situation. She kept to the alleys, avoiding the main street, and made her way to the livery stable without being seen. Owen was waiting inside, her horse already saddled. He looked up as she entered, his expression grim. "They're making inquiries all over town," he said without preamble. "Won't be long before someone remembers seeing you arrive last night." "I need to leave," Nora said, moving toward her horse. "Wait." Owen placed a hand on her arm, stopping her. "Running blindly got you this far, but those men know these mountains better than you do. You need a plan." Nora hesitated, torn between the desperate urge to flee and the knowledge that he was right. "I can't stay here." "No, you can't," Owen agreed, "but I have a cabin up in the high country about 15 miles from here. I use it during hunting season. It's remote, well hidden. You'd be safe there while we figure out what to do next." "We," Nora echoed, surprised. Owen's expression was resolute. "I'm not in the habit of turning people over to men who look like hired guns. Whatever you did—" "I didn't steal anything that wasn't already mine by right," Nora interrupted fiercely. "And those men work for Charles Blackburn, who's killed people for less than what I've done." "Blackburn?" Owen's expression darkened. "The railroad magnate," Nora nodded, watching his reaction carefully. "I've heard stories," Owen said grimly. "None of them good." He seemed to come to a decision. "All the more reason to get you somewhere safe. I'll take you to the cabin." "Why would you risk yourself for me?" Nora asked, needing to understand. Owen was silent for a long moment, adjusting the straps on her saddle. "Let's just say I know what it's like to be hunted for something that wasn't my fault, and I know what Blackburn's type are capable of." He met her eyes again. "Besides, my ma raised me not to turn my back on someone in need, especially a lady." Nora felt a flicker of hope for the first time in days. "Thank you," she said simply. Owen nodded once, then led his own horse from a stall, a sturdy buckskin gelding. "I'll need to gather some supplies first. Food, ammunition. Wait here and stay out of sight. I'll be back within the hour." While he was gone, Nora paced anxiously, jumping at every sound. She checked her saddlebags, reorganizing her meager possessions, and kept a watchful eye on the stable doors. When Owen finally returned, leading a pack horse loaded with supplies, relief flooded through her. "We'll leave through the back trail," he said, securing the last of the supplies. "It's longer but less visible. If anyone asks, Martha will say you paid your bill and left at dawn, heading east toward the railroad." "You've thought of everything," Nora said, impressed despite her anxiety. Owen offered a small smile. "Comes from living out here. You learn to stay a step ahead." He handed her a bundle of cloth. "Found these at the general store. Not much, but they'll be more practical than what you're wearing." Nora unwrapped the bundle to find a man's shirt, trousers, and a sturdy coat. Men's clothes. "Easier to ride in and less conspicuous from a distance," Owen explained. "There's a small room in the back where you can change." The clothes were too large but infinitely more practical than her torn dress. Nora rolled up the sleeves and pant legs, used a length of rope as a belt, and stepped out feeling like a different person. Owen looked up from adjusting his saddle, his eyes widening slightly before he gave an approving nod. "Better for riding. Your dress is in the saddlebag if you want it later." They left through a back door of the stable, leading their horses until they reached the cover of trees before mounting. Owen set a careful pace, avoiding the main trails and keeping to the shelter of the forest where possible. They rode in silence for the most part, both alert for any sign of pursuit. By midday, they had climbed higher into the mountains, the air growing cooler and the forest denser. Nora's muscles ached from the continued riding after days already spent in the saddle, but she didn't complain. Every mile put distance between her and Blackburn's men. Owen called a brief halt beside a small stream, allowing the horses to drink while they stretched their legs. "How much further?" Nora asked, splashing cold water on her face. "Another few hours," Owen replied, scanning the terrain behind them. "We're making good time." Nora studied him as he refilled their canteens, the confident way he moved, the alertness in his posture. "You said you know what it's like to be hunted," she ventured. "What did you mean?" Owen's hand stilled briefly before continuing their task. "That's a story for another time," he said, his tone making it clear the subject was closed. They continued their journey, the trail growing steeper and more challenging. Late afternoon found them traversing a narrow ridge, the valley spread out below them. Owen pointed to a distant plume of smoke rising from among the trees. "Mineral Point," he said. "From here, we head west, deeper into the mountains." As dusk approached, they finally reached a small clearing nestled against a rocky hillside. A cabin stood among the pines, sturdy but weathered, with a stone chimney at one end. "Not much to look at," Owen said as he dismounted, "but it's solid and warm once the fire gets going." Nora slid from her horse, legs trembling with exhaustion. "It looks perfect." The cabin's interior was simple: one main room with a fireplace, table, chairs, and a narrow bed in one corner. A small lean-to kitchen occupied the back wall, with shelves holding basic provisions. Owen efficiently started a fire while Nora unsaddled the horses under his direction, leading them to a small corral attached to the side of the cabin. By the time they'd brought in the supplies, the fire had taken the chill from the air, and the cabin felt surprisingly welcoming. "You take the bed," Owen said, pulling provisions from his packs. "I'll make up a pallet by the fire." "I can't take your bed," Nora protested. "You've been running for days," Owen said firmly. "You need proper rest." Too exhausted to argue, Nora accepted his generosity. While he prepared a simple meal of beans, bacon, and coffee, she finally allowed herself to consider her situation. She was still in danger, but for the first time since fleeing St. Louis, she wasn't completely alone. Over dinner, seated at the small table near the fire, she found herself studying Owen's face in the flickering light. There was strength there, but kindness too, and something in his eyes, a shadow of past pain that matched her own. "Why did you really help me?" she asked suddenly. "The truth this time." Owen set down his tin cup, considering her with those steady blue eyes. "Partly what I said before, I don't like bullies, and men like Blackburn are just that, but also—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "Also because I saw something in your eyes I recognized. Something that told me you weren't running from justice but toward it." Nora's breath caught. His perception unsettled her, yet also created a strange sense of connection. "You're right," she admitted softly. "I'm not a thief. The valuable property they claim I stole are letters that belong to me, correspondence between Blackburn and my late father that proves he swindled my family out of everything we had." Owen leaned forward, his interest evident. "How so?" "My father was Blackburn's business partner in the early days," Nora explained, the familiar pain rising as she spoke. "They built the railroad line from St. Louis to Kansas City together. When my father died suddenly 3 years ago, Blackburn produced documents showing that my father had sold his shares to cover gambling debts." "But that wasn't true," Owen guessed. Nora shook her head, anger flaring. "My father never gambled a day in his life. He was a careful, cautious man who built that business from nothing. But Blackburn had the courts in his pocket, and my mother and I were left with nothing but our house. And the letters prove this. They show that Blackburn forged the sale documents. My father never sold his shares. Blackburn stole them after his death." Nora's hands clenched into fists on the table. "My mother died last month, heartbroken and destitute, while that monster lives in luxury built on our family's work." "So you decided to take justice into your own hands," Owen said, not as a judgment but with understanding. "I worked as Blackburn's secretary for the past year," Nora explained. "It was the only way to get close enough to find evidence. He never recognized me. Why would he? He'd only seen me as a child, and now I was just another faceless employee. Until you found the letters and he realized who you were," Owen concluded. Nora nodded. "I didn't plan to run. I was going to take them straight to the authorities. But one of Blackburn's men saw me with the letters, and I heard him telling Blackburn that Fletcher's daughter had been in the office. I knew then that if I stayed, I'd never make it to the courthouse alive." Owen was silent for a long moment, absorbing her story. "These men following you, they're not just after the letters, are they?" "No," Nora said grimly. "Blackburn doesn't leave loose ends. They're here to make sure I never testify against him." The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, an owl hooted and the wind whispered through the pines. "We'll need a plan," Owen finally said, his voice steady and determined. "Those letters need to reach a federal marshal, not a local sheriff who might be in Blackburn's pocket." "We?" Nora asked again, struck by his continued use of the word. Owen's eyes met hers across the table, unwavering. "You don't have to face this alone, Nora. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Something warm unfurled in Nora's chest at his words, something she couldn't afford to examine too closely, not when her life still hung in the balance. But as she finally lay down on the narrow bed that night, listening to Owen moving quietly around the cabin, she felt the first tentative stirrings of hope. Morning brought a stillness to the mountain air that seemed to hold the world suspended. Nora woke to the scent of coffee and found Owen already up, tending the fire. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's single window, casting patterns across the wooden floor. "Sleep well?" Owen asked, pouring coffee into a tin cup and offering it to her. "Better than I have in weeks," Nora admitted, accepting the cup gratefully. The bed had been narrow but comfortable, and knowing Owen was keeping watch had allowed her to truly rest. Owen nodded, seeming pleased. "Good. You'll need your strength. I've been thinking about our next move." They sat at the table with their coffee while Owen laid out his thoughts. "The nearest federal marshal is in Helena, about 100 miles north. Going there directly would be risky. Blackburn's men will be watching all the obvious routes. What do you suggest?" Nora asked, trusting his knowledge of the territory. "There's a man I know in a settlement about 3 days' ride from here, James Cooper. He was a lawman back east before settling out here. He still has connections with the federal authorities." Owen traced a route on a rough map spread between them. He could get your letters to the right people without drawing attention. Can he be trusted? Nora asked, wary after so much betrayal. With my life, Owen said firmly, and now with yours. They spent the day preparing for the journey ahead. Owen showed Nora how to use the rifle he'd brought, patiently correcting her stance and grip until she could hit a target with reasonable accuracy. I hope you won't need this, he said as she practiced, but best to be prepared. Later, they ventured a short distance from the cabin to check for signs of pursuit. Finding none, Owen decided they would remain at the cabin for one more night before setting out at dawn. It'll give you another day to recover, he explained, and give those men time to spread out their search. The longer they go without finding your trail, the thinner they'll have to stretch their resources. That evening, as they sat by the fire after a meal of rabbit that Owen had snared, Nora found herself studying his profile, curious about the man who had so readily come to her aid. You know my story now, she said. Will you tell me yours? How did you end up in Mineral Point? Owen was quiet for so long that Nora thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke, his gaze fixed on the flames. I came west after the war. Couldn't settle back into normal life in Pennsylvania after what I'd seen. You fought for the Union? Nora asked softly. Owen nodded, a shadow crossing his features. Enlisted in '63 when I was 18, saw things no man should see. He paused, taking a sip from his cup. After it ended, I drifted west. Worked cattle drives, broke horses, whatever paid. Ended up in Mineral Point 5 years ago when my horse threw a shoe. Livery owner was looking to retire, offered to sell me the business. Seemed as good a place as any to stop running. And the being hunted part. Nora prompted gently. Owen's jaw tightened. That was before Mineral Point. I worked for a cattle baron in Wyoming for a while. His foreman was a cruel man who beat one of the younger hands nearly to death for a minor mistake. I stepped in. Things got heated and he pulled a gun. Owen's voice was flat, emotionless. I was faster. He died. Self-defense, Nora said. Yes, but he was the owner's nephew, had to leave in the night with a bounty on my head. Owen finally looked at her. It was eventually sorted out when other hands came forward about his brutality, but for a while there, I knew what it felt like to be hunted for something that wasn't my fault. The parallels to her own situation weren't lost on Nora. Is that why you believed me? Why you helped me? Partly, Owen acknowledged, but mostly it was because of how you stood in that stable, exhausted, terrified, but still fighting, still determined. A small smile softened his features. Reminded me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing what needs doing despite the fear. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of shared understanding that transcended their brief acquaintance. Nora felt drawn to this man in a way she couldn't explain, not just gratitude for his help, but something deeper, a connection that both frightened and exhilarated her. Before she could examine the feeling further, a sound outside the cabin froze them both. A twig snapping, too deliberate to be an animal. Owen was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, motioning for Nora to stay down. Get your gun, he whispered, moving silently to the window. Nora retrieved the pistol he'd given her, heart hammering in her chest. Owen peered carefully around the edge of the curtain, then relaxed slightly. Dear, he said, the tension leaving his shoulders. Just a buck moving through the clearing. Nora exhaled shakily, lowering her gun. I'm jumping at shadows. Caution keeps you alive, Owen said, returning to his seat but keeping the rifle close. We should get some rest. Long day tomorrow. As they prepared for sleep, the momentary danger had broken the intimacy of their conversation. But Nora found herself watching Owen as he spread his bedroll near the fire, aware of a growing warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the flames. They set out at first light, the morning air crisp and clear as they rode from the cabin. Owen had carefully obscured their tracks and left the cabin looking undisturbed, in case Blackburn's men eventually found it. The journey to reach James Cooper would take them through increasingly rugged terrain, away from established trails. Owen led the way confidently, occasionally stopping to point out landmarks or check for signs of other travelers. "We'll follow this ridge for a few miles," he explained as they paused at midday to rest the horses. "Then cut down through that valley to the west. It's a harder route, but less likely to be watched." They made good progress that first day, camping that night in a sheltered grove beside a small stream. Owen showed Nora how to set up camp with minimal impact, leaving little trace of their presence. "You're good at this," she observed as he efficiently built a small, nearly smokeless fire. "Necessity teaches quickly," he replied with a slight smile. "First year out west, I made every mistake possible, learned the hard way how to survive out here." As darkness fell, they kept their fire small, speaking in low voices. The night was clear, stars spreading across the sky in a dazzling display that made Nora catch her breath. "It's beautiful," she said, gazing upward. "In St. Louis, you can hardly see the stars at all." Owen followed her gaze. "That's one thing I love about this country. Reminds you how small our troubles really are, or how vast," Nora countered. "Out here, a person could disappear completely." "Is that what you want?" Owen asked quietly. "To disappear?" Nora considered the question. "I thought I did. When I first ran, all I wanted was to get far enough away that Blackburn could never find me." She traced patterns in the dirt with a stick. "But now I want justice. I want him to pay for what he did to my family and to who knows how many others." Owen nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Revenge and justice aren't always the same thing." "I know," Nora said. "I don't want revenge. I want the truth to come out. I want him stripped of everything he stole just as he stripped my family." She met Owen's gaze across the fire. "Is that wrong?" "No," Owen said simply. "It's human." The next day brought challenges as they navigated steeper terrain. A brief but intense rain shower in the afternoon left them soaked and chilled, forcing them to make camp earlier than planned to dry their clothes and gear. Owen built a larger fire in the shelter of an overhanging rock, and they hung their wet outer garments on improvised racks. Nora shivered in her damp underclothes, trying to warm herself by the flames. Without comment, Owen draped his spare blanket around her shoulders, his hands lingering briefly before he stepped back. "Should warm up soon," he said, turning to tend the horses to give her privacy. That night, the cold forced them to sleep closer to the fire and to each other. Nora was acutely aware of Owen's presence just a few feet away, his breathing eventually growing deep and regular while she remained awake, watching the play of firelight across his features. He was a handsome man, she realized, not in the polished way of the city gentleman she'd known, but in a more fundamental sense strength, character, and kindness etched into every line of his face. In the short time she'd known him, he'd shown more integrity than most men she'd encountered in her entire life. It was dangerous to let such thoughts take root, she knew. Her situation was still precarious, her future uncertain. Attachment was a luxury she couldn't afford. Yet as she finally drifted to sleep, warmed by the fire and Owen's nearness, she couldn't help but wonder what it might be like to stop running to find a place, and perhaps a person, worth staying for. The third day of their journey brought them to more populated areas, requiring greater caution. They skirted several small settlements, Owen vigilant for any sign of Blackburn's men. By late afternoon, they were approaching their destination, a mining settlement called Elk Creek. James lives just outside town, Owen explained as they paused on a ridge overlooking the collection of buildings nestled in the valley below. We'll approach from the north, avoid riding through town. Will he help us? Nora asked, anxiety returning as they prepared to trust another person with her secret. James is a good man, Owen assured her. He's seen enough corruption in his time to recognize it in Blackburn's actions. They reached James Cooper's homestead just as dusk was falling, a substantial cabin with outbuildings, a corral and cleared land for crops. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lantern light glowed in the windows. Owen approached openly, calling out as they neared the house. "James, it's Owen Vaughn." The door opened, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He squinted into the gathering darkness, then broke into a smile. "Owen, what brings you to these parts?" His expression turned curious as he noted Nora, and with company, no less. "Need your help, old friend," Owen said as they dismounted. "Can we talk inside?" James nodded, his expression growing serious at Owen's tone. "Of course. Bring your horses round to the barn first. Maggie's just putting supper on." The warm welcome of the Cooper home was overwhelming after days on the trail. Maggie Cooper, a cheerful woman with laugh lines around her eyes, took one look at their trail-worn appearance and immediately set about adding to the meal. "You both look half-starved," she declared, placing fresh biscuits on the table. "Eat first, talk later." Over a hearty meal of venison stew, biscuits, and preserved vegetables from Maggie's garden, Nora felt herself gradually relaxing. The normalcy of sitting at a proper table, the gentle banter between James and his wife, created an atmosphere of safety she hadn't experienced since before her father's death. After dinner, when Maggie had tactfully withdrawn to give them privacy, Owen explained their situation to James. The former lawman listened intently, asking occasional pointed questions, but mostly absorbing the information in thoughtful silence. Nora produced the letters from their hiding place, spreading them on the table for James to examine. His expression darkened as he read through them. "These are damning," he said finally, looking up at Nora. "Clear evidence of fraud and likely worse. Blackburn's built his empire on corruption, but he's been too powerful for anyone to challenge until now." "Can you get them to someone who'll act on them?" Owen asked. James nodded slowly. "I know a federal judge in Helena, incorruptible old bastard who's been trying to build a case against Blackburn for years. These letters could be exactly what he needs." He gathered the papers carefully. "I can leave for Helena tomorrow." "What about Nora?" Owen asked. "Blackburn's men are still hunting her." "You're both welcome to stay here," James offered. "The homestead is isolated and few people know of my connection to Owen." Nora shook her head. "I can't put your family at risk. These men are dangerous." "She's right," Owen agreed reluctantly. "If they somehow track us here, it would endanger you and Maggie." James considered this, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "I have a line shack about 10 miles north of here. It's basic but secure with good sight lines in all directions. You could stay there while I'm in Helena." "How long will it take?" Nora asked. 4 days to reach Helena, maybe a week to get the proper authorities mobilized, depending on who's available." James met her eyes steadily. "Justice moves slowly, Miss Fletcher, even with evidence like this." "But it will move," Nora pressed. "With these letters?" "Yes, Blackburn has powerful friends, but he also has enemies who have been waiting for a chance like this." James's expression was resolute. "I give you my word I'll make sure these reach the right hands." Later, as Maggie showed them to separate rooms for the night luxuries after their days on the trail, Nora found herself standing in the doorway of her room as Owen prepared to enter his across the narrow hallway. "Owen," she called softly. When he turned, she struggled to find the right words. Thank you for believing me, for helping me." Owen's expression softened. "You've shown more courage than most men I've known, Nora. I'm proud to stand with you in this fight." Their eyes held for a long moment, and Nora felt that same connection from the cabin, stronger now. Before she could examine it further, Maggie appeared with fresh towels, breaking the moment. "You'll both want to wash up," she said cheerfully. "Hot water's on the stove." As Nora closed her door, she leaned against it, heart beating faster than the brief exchange warranted. In the midst of danger and uncertainty, she was developing feelings for this man who'd risked everything to help her, feelings that complicated an already complex situation. Morning brought another parting. After breakfast, James prepared to leave for Helena with the precious letters secured inside his coat. He and Owen conferred over maps, planning the route to the line shack where Owen and Nora would wait. "Keep to the forest until you're well past Miller's Creek," James advised. "There have been strangers asking questions in town the past few days. Could be coincidence, but better safe than sorry." Owen nodded, his expression grim. "We'll be careful." Maggie packed food for both parties, provisions for James's journey to Helena, and supplies for Owen and Nora at the line shack. Her efficiency spoke of previous experience with urgent departures. "You take care of each other," she told them as they prepared to leave, embracing Nora warmly despite their short acquaintance. "And come back when this is over. I want to hear how it all turns out." They left the Cooper homestead by separate routes, James heading east toward Helena, while Owen and Nora rode north toward the line shack. The day was clear and cool, the mountains rising majestically around them as they followed game trails through the forest. "James seems confident about the letters," Nora said as they rode side by side along a wider stretch of trail. "If anyone can get them to the right people, it's him," Owen assured her. "He spent 20 years as a lawman back east before coming west, still has the respect of many in authority." "And then what?" Nora asked, the question that had been haunting her finally voiced. "What happens after?" Owen glanced at her, understanding the deeper meaning behind her words. "That depends on you, I suppose. You could return to St. Louis, reclaim what's rightfully yours." Nora tried to imagine returning to her old life and found she couldn't. Too much had changed, she had changed. "I don't think there's anything left for me there," she admitted. "Even if Blackburn is brought to justice, that life is gone." "Then perhaps it's time to build a new one," Owen suggested, his eyes on the trail ahead. "There's opportunity out here for those willing to work for it." "In Mineral Point?" Nora asked, watching his profile. "Perhaps," Owen said, a small smile playing at his lips. "Town could use a school teacher. I noticed you reading James's books last night. Not many out here appreciate literature the way you seem to." The idea took root immediately. A small school, children eager to learn, a community where she might belong. It was a future she hadn't allowed herself to contemplate, too focused on survival and justice. "I'd need a proper education," she said, considering it seriously. "Helena has a teacher's college," Owen replied. "Once this business with Blackburn is settled, you could study there." The casual way he spoke of their futures, as if their paths might naturally continue together, warmed Nora in a way the bright sun overhead couldn't explain. She wanted to ask what role he saw for himself in that future, but held back, uncertain. They reached the line shack by mid-afternoon, a simple one-room structure built of logs, with a stone fireplace and sturdy shutters on its two small windows. Despite its simplicity, it was clean and well-maintained, with a stack of firewood along one wall and basic furnishings. "James uses it during hunting season," Owen explained as they unpacked their supplies. "It's not much, but it's defendable if it comes to that." The mention of potential danger sobered them both. While they'd seen no sign of pursuit, Blackburn's men were still out there, still hunting. The relative safety of the shack was temporary at best. As they settled in, establishing a routine of shared tasks, Nora found herself watching Owen the confident way he moved, the gentleness in his hands as he tended the horses, the quiet strength that had become her anchor in the storm of the past days. Evening brought a spectacular sunset, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. They sat together on a fallen log outside the cabin, eating a simple meal as darkness slowly claimed the land. "It's strange," Nora said, breaking a comfortable silence. "A week ago I was running for my life, certain I'd never feel safe again, and now—" She gestured to the peaceful scene around them. "And now," Owen prompted when she didn't continue. Nora turned to him, moonlight silvering his features. "Now I'm still in danger, still hiding, but I feel hopeful because of you." Owen's eyes held hers, something unspoken passing between them. "Hope's a powerful thing, Nora. Sometimes it's all that keeps us going." "It's more than that," she said softly, finding courage in the darkness. "You could have turned me in or simply sent me on my way. Instead, you risked everything to help me, a stranger." "You're not a stranger anymore," Owen said, his voice low. "These past days, I've come to know you, your courage, your determination, your strength, your kindness despite everything you've endured." He hesitated, then reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. When she didn't move, his hand gently covered hers where it rested on the log between them. "I don't know what happens next," he continued, his eyes never leaving hers. "But I know I want to be part of it, part of whatever future you build after this is over." Nora's heart raced at his words, at the warmth of his hand on hers. "I'd like that," she whispered. "Very much." The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility. Owen leaned forward slightly, and Nora found herself moving to meet him, drawn by a force stronger than fear or caution. Their lips met in a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then growing in confidence as Nora's hand moved to his shoulder, his arm encircling her waist. In that moment, the danger, the uncertainty, all fell away, leaving only this connection that had grown between them against all odds. When they finally parted, Owen rested his forehead against hers, his breathing unsteady. "I've wanted to do that since that first night in Mineral Point," he admitted. Nora smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "Even when I was covered in trail dust and half-starved." "Even then," Owen said, his smile matching hers. "There was something about you, a fire that all your troubles couldn't extinguish." They stayed outside a while longer, talking of small things, memories of childhood, favorite books, simple pleasures they'd known before life had complicated everything. It was a respite, a brief oasis of normalcy in the desert of their current circumstances. Later, as they prepared for sleep inside the cabin, the practical reality of their situation reasserted itself. One narrow bed, barely wide enough for two, and the floor. "I'll take the floor," Owen said immediately, reaching for his bedroll. "Don't be ridiculous," Nora said, surprising herself with her boldness. "It's cold, and that floor looks harder than the trail we've been sleeping on." She hesitated, then continued softly, "The bed's small, but I trust you, Owen." His eyes searched hers, finding no uncertainty there. "If you're sure." "I am." That night they lay side by side in the narrow bed, Owen's arm around her shoulders, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder. It was innocent, both still mostly clothed, merely sharing warmth and comfort, but it felt more intimate than anything Nora had experienced before. As she drifted toward sleep, listening to the steady beat of Owen's heart beneath her ear, Nora realized she no longer felt like she was running. For the first time since her father's death, She felt as if she might be moving toward something instead, something worth all the pain and fear it had taken to get here. The days at the line shack fell into a pattern. They took turns standing watch, though they saw no sign of pursuit. Owen taught Nora more about survival in the wilderness, how to move silently through the forest, how to read animal tracks, how to find food and water if needed. In the evenings, they talked, learning each other's stories in greater detail. Nora told Owen about her childhood in St. Louis, her father's dedication to building the railroad, her mother's gentle strength that had faltered in the face of losing everything. Owen shared more about his time in the war, the nightmares that still sometimes plagued him, and his gradual healing in the peace of the mountains. He spoke of his hopes for expanding his stables in Mineral Point, perhaps adding a horse breeding operation once he'd saved enough. Their growing feelings for each other remained largely unspoken, but were expressed in small ways, a touch as they passed each other in the cabin, shared smiles over meals, the increasing comfort of their nights spent side by side in the narrow bed. On the fourth day, as they were gathering firewood near the cabin, the crack of a rifle shot shattered the peaceful afternoon. The bullet splintered the bark of a tree inches from Nora's head. Owen reacted instantly, pulling her down behind a fallen log as a second shot rang out. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his revolver. Heart pounding, Nora pressed herself against the damp earth, trying to control her panic. "How did they find us?" "Don't know," Owen said grimly, scanning the trees for movement. "But we need to get back to the cabin. Our rifles are there." Another shot kicked up dirt near their position. Owen located the source, a glint of metal among trees about 100 yards away. He fired twice in that direction, not aiming to hit but to force their attacker to take cover. "When I say run, head straight for the cabin door," he instructed. "I'll cover you." Nora nodded, gathering herself for the sprint. The cabin was only about 30 yards away, but it would be the longest 30 yards of her life. "Now," Owen shouted, standing to fire repeatedly toward the hidden shooter. Nora ran, expecting at any moment to feel the impact of a bullet. She reached the cabin door, yanked it open, and dove inside. Seconds later, Owen followed, slamming the door behind him and dropping the heavy wooden bar into place. "Windows," he said tersely, grabbing his rifle from beside the bed. Nora moved quickly to secure the shutters while Owen took position at a small firing port beside the door. They worked in tense silence, transforming the peaceful cabin into a fortress within minutes. "How many?" Nora asked, retrieving her own rifle and checking that it was loaded. "At least 2, maybe more," Owen replied, his eyes never leaving the tree line. "One shooting from the east, and I spotted movement to the north." "Blackburn's men," Nora said, the statement not a question. Owen nodded grimly. "Must have tracked us from the Cooper place somehow." "James and Maggie," Nora began, fear for their friends overriding her own terror. "James would have been long gone before they arrived," Owen reassured her. "And Maggie's no fool, she'd have spun a tale about travelers passing through, nothing more." They fell silent as voices called from the woods. "We know you're in there, Fletcher," a man shouted. "Come out now and nobody else gets hurt." "And if I don't," Nora called back, surprising herself with her steadiness. "Then your cowboy friend dies first and you watch before we finish you too," came the reply. "Blackburn wants his property back, but he didn't say what condition you had to be in." Owen's jaw tightened at the threat. "4 of them," he said quietly. "They're spreading out, trying to surround the cabin." "What do we do?" Nora asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Owen's eyes met hers, determination replacing fear. "We hold out. James should reach Helena tomorrow or the next day. Once he delivers those letters, Blackburn will have bigger problems than finding you. And until then, we make them work for every inch," Owen said grimly. As if in response, a fusillade of bullets hit the cabin walls, thudding into the solid logs. One broke through a shutter, sending splinters flying across the room. Owen fired back through the firing port, rewarded by a cry of pain from outside. "Got one," he said without satisfaction. "That might make them more cautious." The shooting stopped, followed by angry voices too distant to make out clearly. Nora moved to another window, peering through a crack in the shutters. "They're pulling back to the trees." "They'll wait for dark," Owen predicted, reloading his rifle. "Try to rush us when we can't see them coming." The waiting was almost worse than the shooting. As afternoon faded toward evening, Nora and Owen prepared for the night ahead. They filled every available container with water from the cabin's barrel, positioned ammunition within easy reach of their defensive positions, and moved furniture to create additional barriers. "If they set fire to the roof, we'll have to run for it," Owen said, checking the back window that overlooked a steep slope down to a creek. "This way would be our best chance into the creek bed and down the mountain." Nora nodded, committing the escape route to memory. The practical preparations helped keep panic at bay, but as darkness fell, fear crept back in. She found herself remembering all the stories she'd heard of frontier cabins besieged by attackers, of the grisly fates that often awaited those inside. Owen seemed to sense her thoughts. He paused in his preparations to cross to where she stood by the fireplace. Without words, he pulled her into an embrace, his arms strong around her. "We'll get through this," he said softly against her hair. "Together." Nora clung to him, drawing strength from his solid presence. "I'm sorry I brought this to your door," she whispered. "You should never have been involved." Owen drew back slightly, his hands moving to frame her face. "Don't apologize for fighting for what's right," he said firmly. "I chose to help you, Nora. I'd make the same choice again." His eyes held hers in the dim light, and then he was kissing her not gently as before, but with an urgency born of danger and the knowledge that time might be short. Nora responded in kind, her arms tightening around his neck, pouring all her fear and hope and newfound feelings into the kiss. When they finally parted, breathless, Owen rested his forehead against hers. "If we get out of this, when?" Nora corrected, surprising herself with her certainty. "When we get out of this." Owen smiled, a flash of white teeth in the gathering darkness. "When we get out of this," he amended. "I want to court you properly, Nora Fletcher. No danger, no running, just us figuring out what this is between us." "I'd like that," Nora said softly. "Very much." A shot hitting the cabin wall broke the moment. Owen moved back to his position by the window, rifle ready. "Here they come," he said grimly. The night became a blur of tension and brief, terrifying exchanges of gunfire. Blackburn's men attempted several rushes toward the cabin, driven back each time by Owen and Nora's determined defense. During one attempt, a bullet grazed Owen's arm, leaving a bloody furrow that Nora bandaged with strips torn from her petticoat. "It's nothing," he insisted when she fussed over the wound. "Barely a scratch." Dawn brought a temporary lull in the attacks. The besiegers had pulled back to the tree line, leaving one of their number sprawled motionless in the clearing before the cabin, evidence of Owen's marksmanship during a particularly bold rush in the darkest hours of the night. Nora's hands were raw from reloading, her ears ringing from the constant gunfire, but determination had replaced fear. They had survived the night. Each hour that passed brought James Cooper closer to Helena with the evidence that would end Blackburn's reign of corruption. "They'll try again," Owen said, checking their dwindling ammunition. "Probably waiting for us to get careless with exhaustion." As if his words were a prophecy, a new sound reached them, the crack and whoosh of flames. Nora rushed to the back window in time to see one of Blackburn's men retreating from the corner of the cabin, having just thrown something onto the roof. "They've set fire to the roof," she called to Owen. He joined her at the window, face grim as they heard the flames taking hold overhead. "We need to leave. Now. Before they expect it." They gathered what they could: Owen's rifle and pistol, Nora's gun, a canteen of water, and the knife from her boot. The smoke was beginning to seep through the ceiling boards as Owen cautiously opened the back window, scanning for attackers. "Clear for now," he said. "They're focused on the front, expecting us to be driven out that way by the fire." Nora slipped through the window first, dropping the short distance to the ground and immediately pressing herself against the cabin wall. Owen followed, closing the shutter behind them to hide their escape for as long as possible. Together, they crept along the back of the burning cabin, then made a dash for the steep slope leading down to the creek. Gunfire erupted behind them as they were spotted, bullets kicking up dirt at their heels as they half ran, half slid down the embankment. The creek bed offered some cover, with large rocks and overhanging vegetation. They splashed through the shallow water, moving as quickly as they dared on the slippery stones, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. "They'll have horses," Owen said between labored breaths as they paused in the shelter of a large boulder. "We need to find a place to hide until help comes." "If it comes," Nora said, the doubt she'd been suppressing finally voiced. Owen's eyes met hers, unwavering. "James won't fail us, but we need to stay alive until then." They continued downstream, the sounds of pursuit growing closer. Blackburn's men had found their trail and were closing in, their voices carrying in the morning air. "There." Owen pointed to a narrow crevice in the rocky bank ahead, barely visible behind a screen of bushes. "It might go back a ways." They pushed through the vegetation to find the crevice opened into a shallow cave not deep enough to be comfortable, but sufficient to hide them from immediate view. They squeezed inside just as their pursuers came into sight upstream. Pressed together in the confined space, they hardly dared to breathe as boots crunched on gravel nearby. Voices argued about which way their quarry had gone, some insisting they must have continued downstream, others suggesting they might have climbed the opposite bank. "Split up," a gruff voice finally ordered. "Parker and Wilson head downriver. Johnson with me up the east bank. Shoot on sight." The sounds of movement faded as the men dispersed to search. Owen and Nora remained motionless for long minutes afterward, ensuring their hunters were truly gone before speaking. "We can't stay here," Owen whispered. "They'll circle back eventually. Where can we go?" Nora asked, acutely aware of their vulnerable position: no horses, limited ammunition, and at least 4 armed men hunting them. Owen thought for a moment. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles from here. Abandoned years ago, but the structure was still sound last time I passed that way. It's well hidden. We might be able to hole up there until help arrives." 5 miles through rugged terrain with armed men searching for them seemed an impossible distance, but they had no choice. Carefully emerging from their hiding place, they set out, moving as silently as possible and using every bit of cover the landscape offered. The journey was arduous, steep climbs, dense underbrush, and the constant need to watch for signs of their pursuers. By mid-afternoon, exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them both. They paused in the shelter of a stand of pines, sharing their dwindling water supply. "Not much farther," Owen encouraged, though fatigue lined his face. The wound on his arm had begun bleeding again, staining the makeshift bandage. Nora studied his pale features with concern. "You need rest." "We both do," he acknowledged. "But not yet." They pressed on, and finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Owen pointed ahead to a nearly invisible structure nestled among trees on a rocky outcrop. "There," he said, "the trapper's cabin." The relief Nora felt at the sight nearly buckled her knees. They approached cautiously, Owen circling the small building to ensure it was unoccupied before they entered. The cabin was little more than a crude shelter, a single room with a dirt floor, small fireplace, and what had once been a platform bed now reduced to a frame without a mattress. But it had solid walls and a door that could be barred, which made it a haven after their harrowing day. "No fire," Owen said as they secured the door. "Smoke would give us away." Nora nodded, sinking onto a rough bench, her legs trembling with fatigue. "Do you think we lost them?" "For now," Owen said, though uncertainty tinged his voice. "But they're determined." Blackburn must have offered a substantial reward. As night fell, the temperature dropped rapidly. Without a fire, the cabin grew bitterly cold. They huddled together on the platform bed frame, wrapped in Owen's coat, sharing body heat as they had during their nights at the line shack, though with far less comfort. "Tell me about Mineral Point," Nora said softly, seeking distraction from their dire circumstances. "What's it like when it's not being visited by desperate fugitives?" Owen's chuckle rumbled against her back where she leaned against his chest. "It's a good town. Started as a mining camp, but it's settling into something more permanent now. There's a church, a school building though no regular teacher, a few stores besides the general merchandise." His arm tightened slightly around her waist. "Good people mostly, hard-working, the kind who help their neighbors when needed." "It sounds nice," Nora said, trying to picture it not as she'd seen it that first night, a blur of buildings in the darkness, but as a real community, a possible home. "It could use a proper library," Owen continued, warming to the subject. "And maybe someone to teach music. I've noticed how you hum when you're doing tasks. You have a nice voice." The simple observation touched Nora deeply, that amid their danger and his own pain, Owen had noticed such a small detail about her. She turned in his arms, facing him in the darkness. "If we survive this," she said, "I'd like to see if Mineral Point could become home." She hesitated, then added softly, "With you." Owen's hand came up to cup her cheek. "Nothing would make me happier," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Their lips met in a kiss that held both tenderness and desperation, the connection of two people who had found each other against all odds, and now faced the possibility of losing everything just as suddenly. Morning brought new dangers. As they cautiously emerged from the cabin to retrieve water from a nearby spring, the distant sound of voices reached them. Blackburn's men, methodically searching the area. "They're too close," Owen said, urgency in his tone. "We need to move." "But where?" They were exhausted, hungry. Owen's wound was clearly paining him, though he tried to hide it, and they had only the weapons they'd carried from the line shack. The decision was made for them when a shout went up from the forest below. They'd been spotted. Grabbing Nora's hand, Owen pulled her into a run, heading higher up the rocky slope behind the cabin. "There's a ridge," he gasped as they ran. "If we can reach it, there's a trail that leads down the other side." Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets whining off rocks as their pursuers gave chase. Nora's lungs burned, her legs protesting the steep climb, but fear gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. They reached the ridge, a narrow spine of rock with dizzying drops on either side. Owen led the way along it, moving as quickly as safety allowed on the treacherous footing. Behind them, Blackburn's men had reached the base of the ridge and were firing upward, their shots going wide in their haste. Almost there, Owen encouraged as they neared what appeared to be a gap in the ridge, the start of the trail he'd mentioned. Just as they reached it, a bullet found its mark. Owen stumbled, a cry of pain escaping him as his leg gave way beneath him. Nora caught him before he could fall, supporting his weight against her side. "I'm all right," he grunted, though blood was already soaking through his pant leg. "Keep moving." They started down the trail, Owen leaning heavily on Nora, his face gray with pain but determination in every line of his body. The trail was narrow but less exposed than the ridge, winding down through scrubby pines toward a valley below. Their pursuers had reached the ridge now, but the narrow passage forced them to come one at a time, giving Owen and Nora precious minutes of lead time. When they reached a bend in the trail that momentarily hid them from view, Owen stopped, breathing heavily. "You need to go on without me," he said, his voice strained. "I'm slowing you down." "No," Nora said fiercely, tightening her grip on him. "We stay together." "Nora, no," she repeated, cutting off his protest. "You said we'd face this together. Did you mean it?" "You know I did," Owen said, his eyes meeting hers. "Then we keep going," Nora said with finality. "Together." Owen's expression softened, admiration replacing the pain in his eyes for a brief moment. "Together," he agreed. They continued their descent, each step clearly agony for Owen but his determination never wavering. The trail grew steeper, more difficult to navigate, especially with Owen's injury. Nora's arms ached from supporting his weight, but she refused to let go. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer again. Their lead was shrinking. As they rounded another bend in the trail, Owen suddenly stiffened, his head lifting as a new sound reached them. "Horses," he said, hope flaring in his voice. "From the valley." Straining her ears, Nora caught it too, the unmistakable sound of multiple horses approaching at speed. But were they friend or foe? The answer came moments later as a group of riders appeared on the trail below them, men in the distinctive uniforms of U.S. Marshals, led by none other than James Cooper. "Owen, Miss Fletcher," James called, spurring his horse up the trail toward them. "Thank God we found you." Relief hit Nora like a physical force, nearly buckling her knees. "James," she gasped, "how did you find us?" "Followed the gunfire," James said grimly, dismounting quickly. "And your pursuers weren't exactly subtle." He took in Owen's bloodied leg with a sharp glance. "You're hurt." "I'll live," Owen said, though his pallor suggested the wound was serious. "Blackburn's men are about to have a very bad day," James finished, gesturing to the marshals who were already moving up the trail, weapons drawn. "These gentlemen are very interested in meeting the men who have been terrorizing civilians on behalf of a man currently being arrested in St. Louis." "Arrested?" Nora repeated, hardly daring to believe it. "Blackburn is being arrested," James nodded, satisfaction clear in his expression. "Your letters were exactly what Judge Williams needed. He issued the warrants immediately and sent these marshals to find you while he returned to St. Louis with a federal escort to take Blackburn into custody." Gunfire erupted from higher on the trail, Blackburn's men encountering the marshals. The exchange was brief and one-sided, followed by shouts of surrender. "Let's get you both down from here," James said, helping Owen onto his horse. "There's a doctor in the nearest town who can see to that leg." As they made their way down the trail, Nora riding double with one of the marshals, the reality of their situation slowly sank in. It was over. The evidence was in the right hands. Blackburn was facing justice, and his men were in custody. They had survived. She looked over at Owen, pale but alive on James's horse, and found him already watching her. Despite his pain, he smiled a smile that held relief, triumph, and something deeper that made her heart race. They had faced it together, just as he'd promised. And somehow, against all odds, they had won. The town of Riverdale was small but possessed a competent doctor who treated Owen's leg with careful efficiency. The bullet had passed through the muscle without hitting bone, and while painful, the wound would heal with proper rest. "You're a lucky man, Mr. Vaughn," the doctor said as he finished bandaging the injury. "A few inches higher, and we'd be having a very different conversation." "I've always been fortunate," Owen replied, his eyes finding Nora where she stood nearby, refusing to leave his side throughout the treatment. They stayed in Riverdale for 2 weeks, allowing Owen's wound to heal enough for travel. The marshals had continued on to Helena after ensuring their safety, taking Blackburn's captured men to face justice. James Cooper remained with them for several days before returning home to Maggie with promises to visit Mineral Point soon. During their convalescence, news arrived from St. Louis. Charles Blackburn had been arrested, along with several of his business associates. The evidence provided by Nora's letters had opened a floodgate of accusations from others he had wronged over the years. His empire was crumbling, and restitution proceedings had begun for his many victims, including Nora. "They want me to return to St. Louis to testify," Nora told Owen one evening as they sat on the porch of the small hotel where they were staying, "and to claim what's legally mine." Owen nodded, his face unreadable in the fading light. "When would you need to leave?" "The trial won't begin for months yet," Nora said. "There's time." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind since they'd reached safety. "Will you come with me?" Owen's expression softened, his hand finding hers where it rested on the porch railing. "Do you want me to?" "Yes," Nora said without hesitation. "I don't want to face it alone, any of it." "Then of course I'll come," Owen said simply. "We'll face it together just as we have everything else." The journey back to Mineral Point was slow but uneventful. Owen's leg improved daily, though he still walked with a slight limp that the doctor assured him would fade with time. As they crested the final ridge and the town came into view in the valley below, Nora felt a strange sense of homecoming, despite having spent only a single night there before. "Welcome back," Owen said, noticing her expression. "It looks different in daylight," Nora observed. "More substantial." "It's growing," Owen agreed. "Lot of good possibilities here." They rode into town together, drawing curious glances from the townspeople who clearly recognized Owen but were puzzled by his extended absence and return with a companion. News traveled fast in small communities, and by the time they reached the livery stable, several people had stopped to welcome Owen home and inquire about his journey. Owen introduced Nora simply as Miss Fletcher, a friend from back east, offering no explanation for their travels together. The townspeople, while obviously curious, respected his reticence. Martha Peterson greeted them at the hotel with a knowing smile but similarly asked no questions. She provided Nora with the same room she'd occupied that first night, now seeming luxurious after weeks of wilderness cabins and trail camps. That evening, Nora joined Owen for dinner in the hotel dining room, aware of the curious glances but focused on the man across from her. He looked more at ease here in his element among people who clearly respected him. "I've been thinking," Owen said as they finished their meal, "about what happens next." "Oh," Nora prompted, setting down her fork. "I can't leave the stables for long," he explained. "My assistant has managed well enough, but there's work that needs doing, and you'll need to return to St. Louis eventually for the trial." Nora nodded, uncertainty creeping in. "Yes, I suppose I will. But in the meantime," Owen continued, "there's the school." "The school?" "The town council has been trying to find a teacher for months," Owen explained. "The last one left to get married last spring. The school building sits empty, except when Martha's daughter holds informal lessons once a week." Nora considered this, the possibility taking shape in her mind. "You think I could teach, without formal training? You're more educated than most anyone in town," Owen pointed out, And it would give you a place here, something of your own, while we figure things out." The hesitation in his voice caught Nora's attention. "Figure what out?" Owen met her eyes across the table, a vulnerability there she hadn't seen before. "Us. What we are to each other, what we could be." He reached for her hand. "I meant what I said about courting you properly, Nora, if that's what you want." Warmth spread through Nora at his words, at the sincerity in his eyes. "I'd like that very much," she said softly. "And I think teaching might suit me well, at least for now." The next morning, Owen introduced Nora to Mayor Halford, a portly man with an impressive mustache and an even more impressive eagerness to fill the vacant teaching position. After a brief discussion of her background edited to omit the more dramatic elements of her recent history, the mayor offered her the position on the spot. "School term starts in 3 weeks," he informed her. "That should give you time to settle in and prepare. Salary's $30 a month, plus lodging in the rooms above the schoolhouse. It's not much, but it's private." "Thank you, Mayor," Nora said, somewhat dazed by the speed of developments. "I'll do my best for the children of Mineral Point." "That's all we ask," the mayor said, beaming. "And having a cultured lady like yourself in town will be good for everyone. Might civilize some of our rougher elements." He winked at Owen, who rolled his eyes good-naturedly. Over the following weeks, Nora settled into life in Mineral Point with surprising ease. The school building was small but solid, with a single classroom downstairs, and 2 rooms above that would serve as her living quarters. The previous teacher had left some books and materials, which Nora supplemented with titles ordered from Helena. Owen called on her properly every evening, sometimes taking her for walks around the town, other times simply sitting with her on the small porch of the schoolhouse, talking until the stars came out. Their shared ordeal had created a foundation of trust and understanding that made their courtship unlike any conventional relationship Nora had observed in St. Louis society. School began with 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 16, the children of miners, merchants, and ranchers from the surrounding area. Nora discovered a natural aptitude for teaching, finding satisfaction in the children's progress and their eager minds. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Nora received word from the federal prosecutor in St. Louis. Her testimony would be required in 2 months' time. The letter brought a shadow to the happiness she had found in Mineral Point, a reminder that the past wasn't fully behind her. "I'll go with you," Owen said when she showed him the letter that evening. They were sitting by the fireplace in his small house behind the stables, where they often spent evenings now that the weather had turned colder. "I promised I would." "The school," Nora began. "Martha's daughter can substitute for a few weeks," Owen said. "The children won't suffer irreparably from a short absence." Nora smiled, warmth spreading through her at his unwavering support. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Owen set aside his coffee cup and moved to join her on the small sofa, taking her hands in his. "Nora," he said, his voice serious, "before we go to St. Louis, there's something I need to ask you." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Yes." Owen's blue eyes held her steadily. "These past months have been the happiest of my life, despite everything we've been through, or maybe because of it." He squeezed her hands gently. "I know it hasn't been long in the conventional sense, but I think when you find the right person, time matters less than what you've shared." "I agree," Nora said softly, hardly daring to hope he was asking what she thought he was. "I love you, Nora Fletcher," Owen said simply. "I think I started falling in love with you that first night in my stable when you were exhausted and afraid but still so determined." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small ring with a modest diamond that caught the firelight. I want to face whatever comes next together, not just the trial, but all of it. Life. Will you marry me? Tears blurred Nora's vision as happiness welled up inside her. Yes, she whispered, then more strongly. Yes, Owen, I love you too. The ring slid onto her finger, a perfect fit. Owen's arms encircled her, drawing her close as their lips met in a kiss that sealed their promise to each other. Their wedding was a small affair held in Mineral Point's church 2 weeks later. Martha Peterson helped Nora sew a simple but elegant white dress, and the townspeople, who had embraced her as their teacher, filled the small church to witness the union. James and Maggie Cooper made the journey from their homestead to stand with them, James serving as Owen's best man. The entire town celebrated afterward with a feast and dancing in the community hall, welcoming Nora officially as Mrs. Vaughn, while also bidding the couple farewell for their journey to St. Louis. They departed by stagecoach the following day, beginning the long journey east. For Nora, it was a return to the place of her birth, yet she felt like a different person than the frightened woman who had fled months before. With Owen beside her and his ring on her finger, she found she could face her past without fear. St. Louis had changed little in her absence, though it felt foreign to Nora after the mountains and clean air of Montana. They stayed in a modest hotel, avoiding the neighborhoods where Nora might be recognized before her testimony. The trial of Charles Blackburn was the sensation of the city, a powerful man brought low by his own corruption. Nora's testimony, clear and unwavering despite Blackburn's glares from the defendant's table, provided key evidence that supported the prosecution's case. Owen sat in the courtroom each day, a steady presence that gave her strength. When she faltered once, describing her father's devastation at being betrayed by his partner, she found Owen's eyes in the gallery, drawing courage from his supportive gaze. Blackburn was found guilty on all counts: fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy among them. The judge, showing no mercy to a man who had shown none to others, sentenced him to 15 years in prison and ordered the seizure of all assets obtained through his crimes. For Nora, the verdict brought not only justice but restoration. The court awarded her a substantial settlement, her father's rightful share of the railroad company, with interest for the years it had been wrongfully withheld. She was suddenly a wealthy woman in her own right. "What will you do with it?" Owen asked as they sat in their hotel room the evening after the verdict, the relief of the trial's end washing over them both. Nora considered the question, the possibilities expanding before her. Some should go to the families of others Blackburn harmed, she decided. And I'd like to establish a fund for education, perhaps scholarships for those who can't afford schooling. Owen smiled, pride evident in his expression. And the rest, Nora said, moving to sit beside him on the small sofa, is for our future, for Mineral Point. Our students will be wondering when their teacher is returning, Owen said, his arm sliding around her shoulders. Our students, Nora repeated, leaning into his embrace. I like the sound of that. They returned to Montana as the first snowfall dusted the mountains, arriving in Mineral Point to find the town had changed in small ways during their absence. Construction had begun on a new building next to the general store, and several new families had settled in the area. The children welcomed Nora back to the schoolroom with enthusiasm and a barrage of questions about the big city. Life settled into a rhythm, teaching during the day, evenings spent with Owen in the home they now shared, weekends exploring the surrounding countryside or visiting with new friends. With her settlement money, Nora established the Fletcher Educational Fund, providing books for the school and scholarships for students who wished to continue their education beyond what Mineral Point could offer. She and Owen also invested in expanding the livery stable, adding a horse breeding operation that quickly gained a reputation for quality stock. As spring returned to the mountains, bringing wildflowers and new growth, Nora stood on the porch of their home, the former line shack, now expanded and improved into a comfortable dwelling, watching the sunset paint the peaks in gold. Owen joined her, his arms encircling her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Vaughn." Nora leaned back against him, contentment flowing through her. "I was thinking about how far we've come. A year ago I was running for my life, certain I'd never feel safe again. And now," Owen prompted, echoing their conversation from months ago. Nora turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face, so dear to her now, so essential to her happiness. "Now I'm home," she said simply. "With you." Owen's eyes, blue as the Montana sky, held hers with a love that still took her breath away. "We faced it together," he said softly, "just like I promised." "Yes," Nora agreed, stretching up to kiss him as the last rays of sunlight gilded the world around them. "Together." And in that moment, with the mountains rising around them and the future stretching bright before them, Nora knew with absolute certainty that running had led her not to escape, but to exactly where she was meant to be, in this place, with this man, building a life founded on courage, justice, and love.